안녕하세요. 좋은 하루 보내고 계신가요? 오늘은 어제 영상에 이어서 비트코인 전문가이자 이 분야에 10년 이상 투자를 해왔고 캐나다에서 최초로 가상화폐 거래소를 만들고 미국에서 Virtual Bitcoin ATM인 코인스트림의 창업자인 마이클 보글의 인터뷰를 마저 듣도록 하겠습니다. 자, 그러면 디스크만 듣고 영상 바로 보도록 하겠고요. 이 영상이 많은 분들에게 나눠질 수 있도록 구독과 라이크 꼭 부탁드리겠습니다. 그리고 지금 같은 마켓에 함께 투자를 하고 싶으신 분들께서는 아래 디스크립션에 페이트런 링크를 클릭하셔서 함께 했으면 좋겠습니다. 제가 만든 컨텐츠들은 어디까지나 정보 전달을 위한 영상들이기 때문에 절대 영상만 보시고 주식들을 매도하지 마시기 바라고요. 본인 스스로 반드시 리서치를 더 하신 다음에 판단을 내리시기 바랍니다.
I think a lot of investors that just start to get into cryptocurrencies and, heard about Bitcoin, saw the rally, are thinking that because we went from, let's say, 35,000 to 73,000 in within 6 months, a lot of people are thinking that this was the rally and now we're going to get a pullback and we didn't even have the halving event yet. So from an expert like you, I'd like to hear what you think will happen. Whereas, we had a rally for sure, but do you think we're going to have a pullback and then go for the real rally in the next 12, 15 months? Or do you think this was a rally and we're heading down?
So definitely this has been a rally that I think has exceeded the expectations of most people that follow Bitcoin. The April halving is unprecedented because this is the first time that Bitcoin has surged to a new all-time high before that pre-programmed halving event. And normally there's a lag period where this all-time high, if it does happen, happens after the halving, and sometimes weeks or months or the year after. So for that to happen before is unprecedented. That's the only way to describe it. And so, yeah, the question investors have on their mind is this it for this cycle, or is there more to come? I think a few of the points that we talked about in terms of how mining fits into this may mean that we're just getting started. And the fact that these ETFs are so new, and I think a lot of people are still waiting. Things happen fast in Bitcoin, but I mean, January, we have the ETF. April, the halving. There's definitely, I think, a wait and see approach that portion of investors have been taking all along, even those that aren't invested in Bitcoin right now. I know from previous cycles through Bitcoin's, let's call it crash or bear market, it was the lowest capital outflow that we'd ever seen in terms of Bitcoin bear markets, right? Typically what happens is Bitcoin hits an all-time high, very volatile. It then goes to a massive low and stays low for quite some time. And typically what we'd seen in the past is massive capital outflows, people selling off their Bitcoins and leaving the crypto ecosystem, at least for the time being. And we didn't see that as much in the previous bear market. Bitcoin more or less stayed put. A lot of coins just sat still in wallets and didn't move. So I think this time around, obviously those battle-tested investors in this market are probably less likely to sell now. So I don't see selling pressure coming from them, but could see selling pressure from people that are, let's say, newer to Bitcoin, that are maybe participating through the ETFs, because there is a lot of liquidity now. It is easy to buy and sell. There is also a lot more capital now in Bitcoin. There are a lot of newer players, newer investors that are participating. And so will they hodl as much as battle-tested Bitcoin investor, or will they be quick to exit as market conditions change? We can also look at other more traditional factors that have impacted the price of Bitcoin over time, right? And that goes back to whether the stock market is rallying or not, right? Typically what we see is when the stock market is not doing well, capital tends to not flow into riskier assets, aka Bitcoin. Capital tends to actually flow out of Bitcoin. And so I think as long as the stock market remains bullish, as long as we're not in a recession period, there could be a rally 2.0, or we could just be getting started with the price of Bitcoin. It would definitely be unprecedented, like I said, for things to explode quickly from here. But these are different times. Bitcoin is more mainstream now than ever, and more accessible than ever, more accessible to corporate America more than ever, not just retail investors. So those factors are things that people should be considering and seeing where it goes.
So it's very interesting. So you're saying that the volatility of Bitcoin is stabilizing, or at least it's not going volatile like 50% per day. And I think that's a good sign because it's getting more recognition and it's being, more and more less thought as a spec play, I guess. But I've heard about the 5.3 rule for the Bitcoin price, but if you do the calculation on the 5.3 rule, it seems like the high for this cycle would be around $80,000 to $85,000 per Bitcoin. But personally, how high do you think Bitcoin might go up in this cycle And also, eventually, how high do you think Bitcoin might go in the future?
There's definitely different philosophies on where the price of Bitcoin is going. I have heard that rule. There's the Plan B philosophy, and there's a few other models that are out there. There's a newer one going around lately called the Bitcoin Power Law. There's an interesting site that monitors it, bitcoinfairprice.com. That one's not as good as picking the tops, but basically what they've shown is if you take the Bitcoin price logarithmically, graph it, you can basically see this band over time where basically Bitcoin never drops below this particular amount as time goes on. So if you look on that graph, it'll show like the previous lows. We'll try and predict the future, and it'll show based on a certain date where it believes, according to that law, where the price of Bitcoin will never go below this threshold again. And so like if I were to pull it up for this time of year, it's showing the bottom price. It says that the price of Bitcoin will never go below 26,893 as of April 2024, according to that graph. Now, again, all of these models are true in retrospect, right? Whether these are accurate in the future, literally no one knows. But if that model were to hold true, then numbers start to get really interesting, right? We start to see kind of like what you're saying, market highs potentially in that sort of 80,000 range, or some say over 100, maybe as high as 130, depending who you ask. Some people believe it'll go even more. Or it may happen where there's almost like a super cycle, like two sort of all-time highs that will get hit at different periods over the next couple of years. But I think that that sort of low point is almost more interesting to monitor than the kind of speculative all-time highs, because the sort of the Bitcoin floors are almost more interesting because they sort of represent more what the price of Bitcoin will be if Bitcoin has this more stabilized mass of people using it, right? And so that's sort of where maybe less volatility, more kind of normalizing of the Bitcoin price will emerge. It remains to be seen. This cycle will be probably the most interesting to watch of all, just because of the level of participation that's now possible in it. To your other point, where the price of Bitcoin will go over time, everyone has a guess, and the stars definitely have to align for these sort of mega predictions to come true in the near term. A lot of it has to do with the adoption of Bitcoin, but it also has to do with other factors, right? Inflation and what the dollar is worth at any point in time. 100 years from now, we kind of assume that the cost that someone spends to buy a car or a house is not going to be the same 100 years from now, just like it wasn't 100 years ago, right? Inflation is something that's very real. Will Bitcoin reach $1 million? Yeah, it could, but that is relative to what the dollar is worth at that point, if that makes sense. I think what most people want to know is, will Bitcoin reach $1 million in the next year? That's much more compelling and interesting than 100 years from now. But Bitcoin is at an all-time high in a very unusual market where inflation is rampant and high interest rates, right? I think a lot of people are surprised that this is happening now. We've sort of outlined these factors as to why it has happened now, right? ETF and halving being two big parts of that. I haven't seen any indicators that we're in a bear market. I think all indicators are showing that Bitcoin is currently in one of its bull cycles. The extent to where it goes, just like the model you pointed out, and I think other models that are out there, I think it's important for investors to understand and look at that and just kind of see what model they agree with. But I think if stars were to align and things were to work out well for Bitcoin in this cycle, most people definitely see a demand shock coupled with a supply shock, which will lead to a further all-time high at some point. But the road along the way, as it usually is with Bitcoin, tends to be volatile. Although these days it's a little bit less volatile, but still volatile. So that's something for investors to definitely keep in mind.
Wow, thank you very much, Michael. I think that was great insights, and we covered a lot of topics here. And again, I want to thank you very much for your time. I'm pretty sure that a lot of people got a lot of insights out of this interview, including myself. So thank you very much again, and I would love to have you as a guest on the back half of 2024 after we see what happens to Bitcoin.
조금이라도 도움이 되셨다면 주위 분들과 나눠주셨으면 너무 고맙겠고요. 구독과 라이크를 해주시면 더욱 감사하겠습니다.